So interesting, when I transitioned from the FBI to the private sector, I had just a very elementary understanding of the fact that there are intel programs in the private sector. Very, very, I would say a low level understanding, both of vendors, contractors, and the in-house security program. So it was a huge learning curve for me. And I still to this day am surprised how much I didn't know.
Welcome to Unspoken Security by ZeroFox, the raw and gritty podcast for cybersecurity professionals who want to understand how threat actors are leveraging the internet. In each episode, your host AJ Nash engages with various industry experts to dissect current trends, share practical insights, and address the blunt truths surrounding security. Ultimately, the lessons learned will enable security professionals to take an intel-driven, proactive approach to physical and cybersecurity that extends past the perimeter. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unspoken Security, brought to you by ZeroFox, the only unified external cybersecurity platform. I'm your host, AJ Nash. For those who don't know me personally, or are first-time listeners, I'm a traditional intelligence guy. I spent about 20 years in the intelligence community, both within the U.S. Air Force and then as a defense contractor. Most of that time was spent at NSA. I've been in the private sector for about 8 years now, primarily building or helping other people build effective, intelligence-driven security practices. I'm passionate about intelligence, security, public speaking, mentoring, and teaching. I'm also deeply committed to servant leadership, which is why I completed my master's degree in organizational leadership at Gonzaga University. Go Zags! The goal with this podcast, though, is to bring all of these elements together with some incredible guests and have authentic, unfiltered conversations, even debates, about a wide range of challenging topics most of us are faced with today. This is not going to be the typical polished podcast. You may hear or see my dog. She's over here. People may swear here. I almost certainly will, frankly. We may argue or debate, and that's all okay. Think of this podcast as the conversation you might overhear at a bar after a long day at one of the larger cybersecurity conferences. These are the conversations we usually have when nobody's listening. So today our guest is Janet Rathod. She's a 16-year veteran of the FBI, so look out for her. She knows her stuff. She spent a few years also as a leader in cyber operations and intelligence at Capital One of my old stomping grounds. And that was before she took on her current role as the global head of cyber threat intelligence at Citibank. She took that position mid-2021. So as you can tell, she's clearly one of the more impressive experts in intelligence and security. And I'm honored to have her here today. So Janet, anything you want to add to that brief introduction?
Thank you for the generous introduction. That was very concise. Nothing to add.
Nothing to add. She's a woman of few words. Makes for a tough podcast, but I think we'll get some more out of her as we go. So listen, for this episode, we're going to focus on helping people understand what we mean when we talk about intelligence as a career field. And you and I talked obviously before, and I think you and I share some of the similar ideas on the challenges of explaining what we've dedicated most of our lives to. We're intelligence professionals, but nobody seems to know what the hell that means. So, in your words, as an expert on the subject, how do you describe the career of intelligence analysis to people?
Yes. So I often think about when I leave the Washington, D.C. area, visit my hometown. So I'm from small town, Nebraska. If I were to go back and say I'm a heart surgeon, everyone would immediately understand what that means.
Absolutely.
When I say I'm an intelligence analyst, right, it doesn't seem to resonate. It doesn't mean much to people. So I really appreciate the opportunity to tell this story. I think it is a very important one. When I think about the field of intelligence analysis, it's really about providing advantage, decision advantage. We collect information from several different sources. We weigh it, we analyze it. So in this ecosystem where we're mired in so much data, so much information, so much disinformation, we're weighing the credibility, and we're ultimately using it to drive decisions. And we use this vernacular, which comes from the military, of tactical, operational, and strategic. So we're driving decision-making at all three of those levels. One thing I'd like to add, and it's something we don't talk about very often, is I feel this is one of the few job roles where you can bring together so many different faculties: geopolitics, economics, technology, cybersecurity, language, culture, history, religion, science, math, psychology. All of those things are relevant within the field of intel analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, right? I've worked on some amazing teams, and I've been lucky enough to work with people, as you said, that have backgrounds in a lot of these different areas, right? It's I think people on the outside who haven't done what we do, or what we've done at least, I think maybe they have a misunderstanding sometimes of how teams are built. It isn't everybody didn't go to university to study the same cultural studies, right, or the same background, right? They're not all
Mhm.
military experts. You mentioned language, you mentioned culture and history, religion, right, which are huge components to a lot of what we do. There's a lot of discussion about understanding motivations of different threat actors, different groups, different or just different cultures. I don't even want to get into adversarial discussions, right? Sometimes we just have to understand the point of view. If you talk about diplomacy, for instance, understanding how a culture, sees the world. The U.S. has a different lens to look through than, say, Japan or China or Great Britain, just to use a few examples, right? So I think you make a really good point that it's one of the things I've enjoyed the most about this industry, about the government and the private sector, is working with so many amazing people that know so many things I don't know. You know, economics is a great example. Man, I've worked with some brilliant economists. I've learned a lot. Not enough. I'm still not making any money, so apparently I don't understand the economy. But I think it's interesting you pointed that out, though. So, in some of the teams you've worked on, for instance, can you give some examples, like not naming names, of course, but of the kind of backgrounds you've stitched together either as a leader or just teams that you've worked on, when you talked about some of these backgrounds and how that's really helped with the analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I look to hire and retain talent, I am always looking for people with non-traditional backgrounds. So I've had analysts on my team who have psychology backgrounds, who have history backgrounds, who speak multiple languages. And what that has done is really helped deepen our understanding of the world around us. And when we think about analyzing threat actors, activities, and trends, when you bring together a team from different backgrounds, different academic backgrounds, you can really not only deepen your understanding, but it goes back to what we just talked about in terms of decision advantage.
Hmm.
It's through that deep understanding of whether it's the adversary or any problem that you're diving into, it's through that deep understanding that you can ultimately drive to more informed decision making.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Yeah, I think, and you've already mentioned it a couple times, and we'll probably mention a couple more. Is that key piece of why do we even do intelligence? And it's about decision advantage. As you've said, right? I tell people our job is to get the right content at the right time to make informed decisions. Now that doesn't mean they're going to make the decisions I think they should make. Lord knows every intel professional has given a recommendation that somebody with authority to make decisions didn't follow. And that's just
Yeah.
because there are
Yeah.
other pieces, right? There can be politics, there can be budget involved. There's a lot of components. Leaders have a lot of things to consider beyond just what intel people, tell them. But I think you're right on in that decision advantage, and that's a key component which comes from a lot of context, which I think really talks, to what you just said about this diversity of thought, right? And to be able to understand beyond just the obvious fact of this happened, isn't enough. We have to say, well, this happened, and here's why we think the next thing might happen, or what we think this might mean, and that's based on all these other components that people may not consider, the cultural aspect and the economics and the specific social economic climate at the time, and whatever's going on politically, and of course then the standard things we all expect to understand about adversaries, whether it's a technical adversary or whether we're talking about a physical component, you know uh, whatever their capabilities might be, right? So I think
Mhm.
I think we're probably going to talk
Absolutely.
about it over and over again, though, is that decision making thing. So
Yes, yes, and it transcends government and private sector. And I,
mhm.
I sort of organize intel programs into three different categories. So I think about the intelligence community, as you know, 18 different
Oh
agencies.
yeah.
I think about private sector companies that do niche intelligence or contract services that are either for the government or the private sector. And then you have private sector intelligence programs that are in-house. They could be focused on physical security, cybersecurity, geopolitical, competitive intelligence. So exactly as you're just outlining the context that drives to better decision making, it transcends all these three different categories. And I think the work that you do on a day-to-day basis falls into that second category. I fall into the third, where I'm currently in a role that has an in-house intel program that's focused on cybersecurity with also a geopolitical lens to it.
Yeah. Well, and it makes sense. And people move between these categories, right? You and I both obviously were in category 1 at one point, that intelligence community component. I've been in category 3. I worked, as I said, I was in Capital One before. I've been on the side of in-house intel. I've been on the vendor side, that Capital 2 component, or that category 2 component you talked about as well. So, I think personally, I'm interested in your opinion on this. The advantage and the disadvantage of being able to move between these categories. Again, we're talking about that diversity of thought. For me, when I went from the government to the private sector, that was obviously a shock, in general, to realize, the difference between everything I thought everybody knew, because we all become insulated and think everybody knows everything we know, and then going to the private sector to a bank and realizing how much wasn't translated, but at the same time, how much I didn't understand about banking and finance and some of the threats they looked at was very interesting. And then, of course, when I moved on to the vendor side and was supporting these organizations, having seen what it's like inside, where does the intel go? What sub-organizations within this large enterprise need which intel? I found that to be really informative, and hopefully makes me better now as I try to support folks. But what are your thoughts? You came out of the government space, you've been in the private sector, a couple of different banks, obviously, so you're really well-versed in what's going on in finance. How did that translate for you? How do you think that helps? And how does that work within your team as to where you're pulling people from?
Yeah, you make an excellent point. So interesting, when I transitioned from the FBI to the private sector, I had just a very elementary understanding of the fact that there are intel programs in the private sector. Very, very, I would say, a low level understanding, both of vendors, contractors, and the in-house security program. So it was a huge learning curve for me. And I still, to this day, am surprised how much I didn't know. So I have made it my mission to try to help. I primarily focus on FBI intelligence analysts who are still in the FBI, but as much as I can help tell the story of private sector intelligence to them, so that when they decide to move to the private sector, they are better equipped, so to speak. But there were times where I was just astonished at how much I didn't know. To the second part of your question, in terms of building teams, so I'd like a combination of those who come out of the intelligence community and those who are sort of born and raised within the private sector environment. I think it makes for a good mix to have both. And it also leads to dissenting opinion, dissenting analysis, different ways of looking at problems and different approaches to analyzing problems. And so I always like to build teams that are just from various backgrounds.
Yeah, I think the same way, and I've, been lucky enough to work with some brilliant folks, as I said, and I feel the same way. I think I have said, and I'm, on record publicly, I talk about this. I do think if you're building a program from scratch, I do think the first key hire should be somebody with an intel background, a serious intelligence professional. I've seen too many organizations who misunderstand intelligence as a career, as we're talking about. And so they might just take somebody who's really, really good at what they do. Say incident response seems to be a common one. The leader in incident response, they're doing a great job. Bob's due for a promotion. Bob, you're the new director of intel. And, Bob's got to go out and figure out how to build an intel team. And they're not the same. And he does what he can and he works really hard at it. And even if he's really dedicated, a lot of times I see those teams don't end up being what they intended, right? Because these aren't intel professionals. And Bob and his whole team end up in a really tough spot because Bob was just put in a bad position to begin with. Whereas if you bring in an intelligence professional, the structure and the foundation, that's all old hat, right? Building intelligence requirements, right? And bringing in tradecraft and standards and product lines and some of those things. And then having the dynamic team, you've already talked about, right? Having folks who have a really good private sector background. So they understand the needs, they understand the pace, they understand what's going to be required and what's going to be delivered and what's going to be done with it. Having all these dynamic bodies you talked about in different backgrounds of economics and history and culture and technology and all that component. Maybe some folks who spend time on the vendor side and reverse, because then you understand the other side. I found that working as a customer side, if I had people on the team who'd spend some time on the vendor side, they might be able to help me translate what my needs are in, hey, this is why this won't happen, boss, because this is what they have to do over here. And they've got 62 requirements. We aren't going to be the top requirement. So, helping translate those languages so you get what you need from vendors and vice versa. So
Such a
I
good
think
point.
I think it's been great to see people transition across these different lines.
Huh. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the point you're making also, it really resonates with me because the story is yet to be told. So to
Mhm.
the very first thing that we discussed when we started our podcast here today is that the American public generally does not have a deep understanding of what this job role is. And so it goes directly to your point where you're saying you've seen scenarios where somebody's just picked up from a different job role and designated the head of
Mhm.
intelligence. That's absolutely what you do not want to do. And I know you and I have talked about this before, but there's two phrases I think that do not resonate positively with us, and that is
Mhm.
connecting the dots and putting together a puzzle.
Yeah.
It reduces this field to sort of a juvenile game. And as we get deeper into the conversation, I think it'll become clear just how sophisticated and difficult the job of an intel analyst is.
God, you're so right. I mean, those are, and I know people don't mean it to feel that way, but that's such reductive terminology, right? As you said, it's just,
Yeah.
are we putting puzzles together? I mean, I know a lot of people in Intel love puzzles. I mean, there's truth to that, certainly. Connecting the dots, I find to be even worse because, I mean, we'll just leave it on B. But I'm with you. It is very reductive, right? There's a lot to this. And I feel like, at some point, we're doing this long enough now. I feel like it's on us, frankly, as Intel folks. We haven't done a good enough job either. The trade-off is, of course,
Yes.
the Intel community has always been this hush-hush behind closed doors thing, which has always been good, I think, for a long time. But now there's enough in the public. There's just enough knowledge out there to be dangerous. And we're not helping educate people. Listen, this isn't just a bunch of smart people with Google. And just as I think we're seeing this influx of people who are claiming to be journalists because they have a camera and they can read a few things, people are claiming to be intelligence analysts because they can read some things and they can come to their own conclusions. And I think both of those are inaccurate ways of looking at it. Journalism has their own standards, and there's a lot that goes into journalism beyond just finding and reporting on things. And intelligence has a lot of standards in tradecraft. I think people don't understand behind the scenes because they just get a product and they go, "Oh, this is some interesting stuff," right? So I think that brings us to the next question we were talking through is, so no matter which category people came from, whether it was the government, whether it was from the vendor side, support teams, or whether it's from a customer, what I would call customer side, from an organization building an in-house Intel team, let's talk about about the skills, right? What are the skills that you think all Intel analysts absolutely need?
Yeah, absolutely. So, three main skills. It's
Mhm.
critical thinking, writing, and briefing. And that
Mhm.
transcends all categories. In the FBI, we have a fourth pillar, and that is legal. And that may not be the case in other academies, other intel agencies that do structured training. And so when I think about those three core things, critical thinking, writing, and briefing, the one that I hone in on and is so absolutely fascinating is the concept of critical thinking, cognitive bias.
Mhm.
And what you'll sometimes hear some of us say is thinking about your thinking. So there are, I'm sure you likely know this because you've studied it as well. Last time I looked it up, there were nearly 200 different cognitive biases. And what I mean by that is our brains have evolved over time to make quick decisions, and it's essentially a survival mechanism. So we're relying on mental shortcuts, and the purpose is to process information quickly. So
Mhm.
it's efficient, yes, and it's based on survival, but it leads to cognitive bias, especially when we're talking about highly complex situations. So
Mhm.
the one example that I was recently thinking about was if I go to Whole Foods and there's 30 different boxes of spinach in front of me,
Mhm.
I don't have the time to weigh them and look at the country of origin and look at how big the leaf structure is before I can make an informed decision. So I make a
Right.
quick, efficient decision, choose what I want, and get on with my day. When we're dealing with either a life and death situation or something as sophisticated as a cyber threat actor and assessing the threat to your firm or your company, you really have to account for your biases. You have to question your assumptions. And in the field of intel analysis, apply what's called structured analytic techniques to
Mhm.
your products and to your overall assessment and overall understanding of the situation.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. So cognitive bias, definitely something I think any Intel analyst, anybody who's been trained at all knows the concept. I won't lie to you. You told me, we're pushing up on close to 200 now. I think you had mentioned like 188 previously. That even blew my mind. Listen, I need to go back and do some more research and studying apparently because I've lost track of some of these along the way, right? So, and theoretically, I have knowledge in this field. I'll never call myself an expert. I'll leave that for somebody else. I think that's pretty arrogant. But at least I have knowledge. I've done this a few times. I'm old, I can tell you that. I've done it a while. And cognitive bias, like I didn't realize there were that many. And you talk about structured analytic techniques, which there's whole books on. I think people don't understand. I've often worked with folks on building Intel programs, and you talk about standards and tradecraft, and I bring out structured analytic techniques, and people just kind of cock their head. And you're like, oh yeah, let's talk about how this really gets done. Like when we get to the end, and you see a product that says we have a high confidence assessment based on intelligence sources. We go through that process. That wasn't just a hunch. We didn't just sit down here and decide, yeah, I read this and I think this. There's a lot in that background that people don't know. And I think, as you said, thinking about thinking is such a deep concept that most of us don't have time to do, especially in tech. You talk about how quickly we have to make decisions. Listen, we're working at the age of cyber. Things are coming at us so fast. And so you have these biases, and I think, one of the big ones you hear about is right now, I would say, we talk about like misdis and malinformation is something I'm very concerned about, talk about a lot. And what I see there a lot is confirmation bias is one that comes to mind, wherein somebody has an idea already. We see this a lot in our political, discourse right now, unfortunately, not just our country, but around the world. People are already entrenched in an idea. And so after that, it's very hard to get them out of that decision, even if we have hard evidence that refutes their thought process. They don't want to hear that because people don't like to be wrong. They don't like that. There's an ego piece to that, right? And at the same time, there's plenty of other stuff out there they can consume that fits, right? So
Yeah.
I'm sure you're
Yeah.
seeing a lot of this, right? This confirmation bias.
Yes. This is such a good one. I think in nearly all circumstances, it's easier. We tend to seek out information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. And this is something that happens in our day-to-day life, and it happens in our workplace. So if I'm an Intel analyst and I've got a specialty, let's just take Russia for instance. Let's say my specialty is Russian FSB, and I have a particular analysis and I want to stick to my analytic line. I may just disregard data or information that comes my way because I want to stick to that analytic line. This is a problem that, again, transcends all three categories. And some techniques to overcome it is just simply being aware that the human mind has these tendencies, and then just being cognizant of your own behavior. So am I disregarding data that's put in front of me that goes against what my analytic line or what my assessment is? I have found that talking to other analysts, even just simply asking another analyst to push on your thinking, push on your analytic line, that always helps. And then, of course, as you and I have talked about through this discussion, applying structured analytic techniques. So there's ways for you to check your assumptions. You can employ a myriad of different techniques with your team of analysts, with your colleagues, to try to help overcome some of these cognitive biases. But I think confirmation bias is an excellent one to dive into.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's great you mentioned, bouncing ideas off of teammates, right? And this is again the discussion about why we have more diverse teams. I think maybe people don't always understand, and it's an odd position to be in, because on the one hand, we're intelligence analysts, we're intelligence professionals, and I know there's plenty of people who think, oh, you think you're smart because it says intelligence, and that's not what it's about. But there's so much humility to be really good at this, to go, hey, listen, I think I know a thing. I think I've got data to support it. Now let me have somebody who's also really smart and knows their background, and let him push me. Let me see if this holds up to scrutiny. And it takes guts and humility once you've gone down the path and you've done the research and you've put something together to go, I'm going to put this all on the line with somebody who might just tear it completely apart and expose me because I failed to notice my own bias, right? I really wanted to believe this apparently. Or you mentioned, dismissing content that refutes what you have to say. People talk about that a lot. one of the standards for producing intel, we talk about timely and accurate and relevant. One of the standards is completeness, which I think a lot of people forget, which is you have to validate, obviously, things. If it's not valid content, you can dismiss it. But if it's validated or equally validated to your other content, you can't just ignore it, even if it doesn't fit your assessment. At a minimum, you have to note, here were the dissenting pieces of content, and this is the way we went with our assessment. And I see a lot of people who miss those. And I wonder if they're missing them because it's cognitive bias and they're choosing to ignore things. Or is it that they were harder to find, which is another bias that we run into when people are in a hurry? And I know you know a lot about availability bias and how that works, especially in, again, this social media age where people are in a hurry. How does that play? And how do we figure out, is it cognitive, I just dismiss things, versus it was just too hard to find and I just didn't have the time for it?
Oh, this is another good one. So it's this concept of overemphasizing readily available information. So exactly as you laid out, something that's easy, that's right at your fingertips. I think we also have a tendency, especially if you're under pressure from, say, an executive who says they want something yesterday, you may throw together a piece of analysis that is just based on what you have in front of you. And that can be a very dangerous thing. A couple of techniques to overcome that, again, is to leverage your fellow Intel analysts. If you are under a time crunch and you're working with a set piece of data and looking to make an assessment that is going to decision makers, tap into the collective, ask for additional information, ask for more sources, outsource some of your research if you need to some of your colleagues. I think there's ways that you can overcome that tendency to just look at what's readily available. Then when you do have some downtime and you're not responding to something that is urgent, just ensure that the sources that you're looking at are coming from different places so that the next time you're maybe under a time crunch, that you already have your sourcing and different pieces of intelligence available to you. So not just relying on what is right in front of you, but doing your deep dive research in between, if that makes sense, as you're building your expertise on your portfolio.
No, that absolutely makes sense. And when you talk about dynamic sources, I think that's a really key point too. So, in our space, in intelligence, obviously if you're in the government space, we have all sorts of, pretty impressive sources. And the private sector, frankly, we do too. There's a lot of different vendors now who have some really cool accesses, whether it's deep and dark web, whether it's, social media monitoring, whether it's, just open source, right? But for a moment, I'm just thinking, just the average person, right? My sister, she's average as anybody, I suppose. Listen, she's got access to all the social media platforms. She watches the news. Things happen in the world, scary, bad, terrible things, right? But is she really taking the time to consume the content that is less likely to agree with her? So the answer is probably no. No offense, Sarah. That's my sister. But the answer is probably no, right? Whereas you and I might. I tell people all the time, listen, on a daily basis, I consume CNN, NBC, Fox, Al Jazeera, NPR, there's local newspapers, 3 or 4 of those. It's a lot of sources. I think I've seen a lot of people that just get into this echo chamber, right? Whether I don't care if they're on the right, on the left, I don't care if they're in different countries. People pick these echo chambers, again, because it fits our biases, right? And it also fits the time constraints we have. It's hard to look at all these sources and then compare them. Well, wait a minute now. That's a very different line of thinking than I got from this news source, and sitting down and comparing them. But it's just so much easier to just go, I already believe this anyway. Let me just listen to people that tell me the thing I want to believe. And, I don't know how you feel about this, but I've been very frustrated by this for the last several years. I have a lot of conversations with people where facts just don't seem to matter anymore. And it's very disturbing because they're so far into this echo chamber, whatever it is. And it just becomes very difficult. And I think it's, conspiracy theories have been on the rise as a result. And we've seen a lot of interesting components to it. But I'm curious, I just rambled on a bit, on your thoughts on how hard this is for the average person who has very little time, but has access to an infinite supply of content coming at them to know their own biases, whether it's, recency bias, whether it's availability bias, whether it's cognitive bias. And where's the truth in all that then? Where do they find the truth?
It's such a difficult question. I think that it is the number one challenge that we're facing as a society today. Our ability to think is deteriorating. And so it's on us as individuals to try to fight against that. I even think about my own attention span, and there's times where I'll click on a news article and then I'll just skim it, or I'll read the first couple of paragraphs and I'm already thinking about the next thing. And so what I've tried to do to combat that is essentially force myself, read the whole thing, consume the whole thing. Don't always be in a rush. And then understanding that if you firmly believe something, gathering information and gathering data and reading the opposing perspective will either help firm up your perspective, or it may make you change your mind. And so versus sort of living in the dark, it's incredibly important to bring in all these disparate pieces of information. And of course, weighing it for accuracy and making sure that you're using reputable sources becomes more and more important. And I recently just had a very similar experience. So I was in a deep dive on the Belt and Road Initiative, and I wanted to believe that it was all bad. I walked into my own research knowing that it was all bad. It's all bad for developing countries. It's all bad for the economy. Then I looked at the data and come to find out some of the outcomes aren't all that bad. So if you have strong feelings about something, if you think something is black and white, that actually should be a red flag to you. If you think something's all bad or all good, chances are you're wrong. And in this case, I was wrong. There's that gray area, and learning to be comfortable and learning to live in that gray area, there's a power to it.
What a great point. Like, both of those points were huge, right? The first, like, I'm going to do it in reverse, but if you are certain about something, you're probably wrong. I think that's a fantastic point, because the world isn't black and white. There aren't, for the most part, there aren't good guys and bad guys. There are people, and people have different flaws. They have different lenses they see the world through. They have different aspects they come through. Things are rarely just black and white. And I think it is easy for people to go, no, they're just wrong. They're just bad. We're just good, or vice versa. And I think that's key. But another huge point you made, which I hope people take away from this, is if you're really entrenched in a position, you believe something strongly, then really you just need to go read the other position, right? You don't need to read more of the things that validate what you already believe. You're done. You've already believed this. You've got enough content to make an opinion. You believe this already. And that's fine. And maybe you're correct. I don't know, whatever the opinion is. But I think you make a great point. Read the other side a lot, because either it will enlighten you. Oh, there's things I didn't know. Or it will, as you said, validate your position. Be like, well, these are ridiculous arguments. None of this makes any sense. This isn't good argumentation. There's no logic to this. There's no facts behind this. And will validate your own position. It doesn't make any sense to continue to read content and sources on a topic that you already know the answer. You already know what they've said and what they're going to believe. You're just pushing yourself further down that bias. You're just building that wall against what might be, an alternate opinion of value. So, I think those are huge points, and I hope people take that away and as you said, think about their own thinking, which is hard to do, especially, we have no time, right? Nobody has energy or time for this. You're right. I read so much every day, but I'm thinking to myself even now, how much do I actually read? How much is it the headline and the skim and I move on versus how much I actually read? I probably need to do a better job too. So with all this in mind, we had talked about the kinds of people doing intel, and we talked about where they come from, the different categories, and the diversity of the teams, and a little bit of discussion on structured analytic techniques. But with all that going on, what kind of training goes into becoming an intelligence professional? Like, where are we getting them? You came from the FBI. I was in the Air Force, and then NSA and Cyber Command, right? So in our cases, I think everybody knows where we came from. We're grown by the government, so to speak. But not everybody is going that route. Federal service and military service are part of it, but where else are we able to create, grow, educate, intel folks that end up working at Citibank or Cap One or Zero Fox, where I am, or wherever it might be, right?
Yeah. I think, for one, no matter who you are, no matter where you work, you should always be in a state of learning. You should always be seeking out training, both formal and informal. And you're spot on when you talk about the government. The FBI, for example, you go into the academy at Quantico and you are trained on critical thinking, writing, briefing, and the law, and you take tests and you have to pass before you can start your job. So there is very structured training. And then throughout your career, you'll continue to receive training in whether it's open source intelligence or critical thinking or any number of things. Could be your subject matter expert in a field of counterterrorism or counterintelligence or cyber, that sort of training as well. So you get a lot of structured training in the government. In the private sector, what I've noticed is that it varies quite a bit from firm to firm, from company to company. And so what that tells me is that you generally have to take it upon yourself to seek out training. And there are so many different things out there. And a lot of it is free and is as simple as just doing a Google search. Other things you have to pay for, such as SANS training, as you probably know all too well. But depending upon where you work, there's a myriad of different opportunities to get structured training. So I break it down into the analytic methodology. So that's your critical thinking, writing, briefing, and then your subject matter area. So you could be a strategic analyst on Russia cyber, for instance. So you'll want that tradecraft training, but then you'll also want the specialty training in your line and in your portfolio.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? And so, I've seen, it's funny you mentioned SANS training, right? Great training, really expensive. Like you really need a corporate sponsor a lot of times to do SANS training. Good shout out to SANS, great training guys. I wish you could help us with some discounts. But I love when I see people who have SANS training on their resume. It tells me they took it upon themselves to accomplish that. And there's some other certifications out there that are gaining traction too. If you don't have $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, there are other certs. I tell people, listen, take anything. Like LinkedIn has some training on Intel. At least it shows me you care, you're trying, you have an interest, you want to learn, because it may not be your background. Federal service, military service course. There are some great university programs I've seen. Mercyhurst is fantastic. They teach the Kent School, which is, CIA's training, right? There's a couple other programs out there. I think James Madison University has a great program, which is, if I remember correctly, is a collaboration between a retired FBI employee and their computer science department. So they actually have a cyber intelligence program at James Madison. So there are some cool university programs. You don't have to strap on a uniform or make it through Quantico, and which is hard, to make it here. There's other ways. And then obviously there's a lot of OJT, as you said. They come in the door and then it's this ongoing process of learning and developing. You don't just graduate and become an Intel professional. You got to continue to learn, and things change. As I just said, I'm going to have to go back and see the biases now. I'm missing some biases. I didn't know we were at 188. So now I got to go back and see what I haven't learned recently. So it never stops.
And I think there's large categories. Yeah, there's no way to memorize all of them.
Oh, no.
That's for sure.
No. So I think that's great, though, to know that there's more than one way to get here. I've seen people that have come through tech who have no formal Intel background, but they wanted to move into CTI. So they got some training, again, SANS training or another certification. They got an opportunity to move. I've also told folks, if you've had the same experience, who said, hey, I want to move into Intel. Well, you've got several years in another, incident response or something in the SOC, something like that. Are you okay with moving back to being a more junior position? You can't take your leadership position with you into a field you've never done. If tomorrow I decided I really want to be a physical therapist, I'm not going to come in leading a physical therapy department. I don't know anything about physical therapy. Yeah. Ask anybody. So I'm going to have to accept that I'm like an intern. I'm going to start over. Have you had that happen? Have you had people ask, and if you had that experience, have you been able to mentor people who said, yeah, I'm willing to give up my experience portion and start over because I really want to go this path? I'm curious if you've run into that or have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I've definitely ran into many people who are looking for a career shift, and it is exactly what you said. Generally, you can't come in at the same level that you were at if you don't have any Intel experience. And so coming in at the right level, but then learning, and there's always opportunities to work your way up in the organization. So definitely have come across that. And it is a very compelling job role. It's high visibility. There's times where you're briefing executives on a regular basis, whether it's the CISO or the executive management team. There's tons of opportunities in this space, and I think people look at it and recognize it and realize it. And you just get to see how intellectually stimulating it is. On any given day, you're diving into a number of very interesting issues, and you get the opportunity to research and write and analyze and brief. And it doesn't get any better than that.
I agree. I was very lucky. Listen, Intel was a mistake for me. It was, I shouldn't say it was a mistake. It was unplanned. I went into the military and I was going to be a cop, and I was going to law school and be a lawyer. Like, everything about my career is just pure luck. I got talked into taking some different tests. I ended up going down the path of linguistics, which I'm not a very good linguist. And that led me to being an Intel analyst. And I couldn't be more thankful, because as I just said, it's incredibly interesting work. The opportunity to get paid to think and to dig into so many different topics over the years and learn a whole lot about the world, which can also be a bit of a burden sometimes, to know things that maybe you wish you didn't, and have conversations with people where you can't correct them because they don't know the access you have. But I'm with you. It's a fantastic career field. And I'm just reminded, there was somebody who reached out to me on LinkedIn a couple of years ago, and he was a manager of a restaurant.
Yeah.
And he reached out and he said, he was working on some computer certifications. He wanted to switch careers, and he asked for advice, and specifically wanted to get into cyber threat intelligence at some point. And that was the discussion we had. He was a manager of a restaurant for like 20 years, but he was fine with that. He wanted to give all that up. He was frankly bored with his career. He'd gone as far as he wanted to. And he reached out to me not that long ago, and it's all worked out. Like, he finished school, he did the training, he's got a job in tech now, and he's made that transition, which I give him credit. I'm not sure 20 years in any career, I'm not sure I'd be able to do it. I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah.
But he's very, very happy, and he's doing work he enjoys. So it's possible, but it took I had that conversation up front to make sure he was okay with the idea. Listen, you're going to come in basic, like, you're in a different career field. You will be an intern, or you'll be a junior analyst starting out. Are you okay with that? And he was, and he was very committed to it. So if he's out there listening,
wow.
I'd call him up by name, but I don't remember at the moment. I feel bad, but I hope he's listening. I hope he's doing well.
That's
so, all right,
fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cool story, right? And there's a few. I'm sure you've had others. I'm sure you've encouraged people to make changes, right? Over a career, we run into a few of those folks, and it's nice to be able to help. And hopefully I help that guy. He seems pretty happy. So,
yes. Am I allowed to ask you a question?
Yeah, sure. Ask me whatever you want.
Do you ever get asked? Do you ever get asked, how do you get, or how do I get to where you are? Because as you were talking about how so many things happened in your career by accident, it got me thinking that we should briefly discuss that. But it sounds like you've been asked that question.
Yeah, I mean, I get asked how do I get where you are, and I tell them to check Google Maps. But no, the truth is, there's no one path, right? My path was an accident. I've said to people, I'm very, very lucky, because I think everything in my career that led me here was probably not planned and a bit of a just lucky. I agree, we make our own luck. I did join the Air Force. I made that decision. I wanted to do something different with my life. That was a good choice. And you make luck as you go. But sometimes it's just about being willing to go where the world's going. I ended up doing terrorism because that's what was happening at the time. So I got into counter-terror work. I got into cyber entirely by accident. I got recruited into a contract when I was doing defense contracting that was cyber focused. And they already had, it was actually a bunch of mathematicians and operations researchers. And they were developing this new process, which was cyber intelligence preparation of the battle space, which became cyber intelligence preparation of the environment, which, for those who are old enough to remember, turned into what is now known as kill chain. That's how old I am. Nice. But I got recruited into that by mistake, and that led me into cyber and a whole different career field I didn't intend to be in. So I've told people it's about putting yourself in a position to take advantage of opportunities, through education, through effort, through socialization, right? Through building networks, and then being willing to, be open to opportunities when they come up that might seem unusual, and just taking that leap and that chance, and being adaptable. And if you make a mistake, and listen, not every move I've made in my career has been good. I've had some jobs that I probably wouldn't take a second time around. But when you're there, make the most of what's there. Hey, I'm gonna do the best I can here. I'm gonna take as much as I can out of this situation. I'll carry it forward. Bad experiences, you bring as much value probably as good experiences sometimes. So, I mean, you can't replicate somebody else's path, right? But those are the big pieces I've told people. Yeah.
Exactly. Luck favors the prepared.
That's
I don't know whose quote that is, but it always resonated with me, because so much of your career path will be by accident or will be serendipity. But if you're prepared for it and you're prepared to take advantage rather of opportunities, it can make a huge, huge difference.
That's a good point. Yeah, I often tell people fortune favors the bold too, which again is somebody else's quote from Greece, or it's a long time ago, so I don't own it. But same thing, right? Being prepared. And then having, the guts, right? Being able to take risks. Very few people in life have been very successful without taking a risk somewhere, big or small. And you take that leap, you trust yourself, and just understand that the chances are you'll be okay either way. Within reason, everybody who I know who's wildly successful has failures in their past. Like, everybody
Oh,
does.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's a
you have to.
huge part of the growing process. The bumps and bruises and calluses that you get along the way, that's what actually makes you a more effective professional and a more effective leader.
100%.
I'm
Yeah.
laughing. You can probably see on the camera, I'm laughing a little bit because I'm thinking we can keep bouncing back and forth with unattributed quotes.
Oh, totally. Yeah. About being an Intel, we probably have 1,000 different quotes because we've all gone through some of them. But no, it's true. The failures make us better. You find me somebody who's never failed at anything, and my guess is they haven't taken a lot of risks. They've lived in a
Yeah,
comfort zone,
yeah.
and maybe they've been successful. But I think you just have to be able to take some leaps and take some risks in there, and then you end up finding a whole different path you didn't expect. Like, if you told me this is where I was going to be, this is not what 7-year-old me thought I was going to be someday. But then again, 7-year-old me thought I was going to be an NFL quarterback. What did that guy know? So, all right, listen, I want to keep the conversation moving here. We've been talking about, I think hopefully the audience is getting a better idea of what Intel is, right? That this is a career field, that there's structure to this, that there's, technique to this, that there's training to this, there's education to this, but we're not perfect, right? And I think that's another challenge is people are like, oh, you're so smart. How come you didn't know this? Or how come you didn't see that? And first of all, predicting the future is really hard for anybody who wants to try. But, we hear people talk about these things as like Intel failures. Now, listen, I worked through 9/11 and we talk about that as an Intel failure. But even beyond that, in the grand scheme of things, you talk about, the Iraq war as a whole, the Iranian Revolution, the Yom Kippur War, the Indian nuclear test. Right now we're watching, right? Russia invading Ukraine. I know people who are Russia experts for decades who right to the bitter end said, I don't think this is going to happen. And then it did. Hamas and Israel is in the news again right now, right? So how do we, first of all, I don't love when people call these intelligence failures. I think you gather everything you can gather. We have to remember you make an assessment based on the best content available at the moment. Adversaries are trying to hide things, so we don't necessarily know everything. They don't always act rationally and sometimes make decisions we didn't anticipate. And also a lot of times people look back on history and say, well, you should have known because of this, but the thing they're referring to happened afterwards. We didn't have the benefit of knowing that thing at the time. But let's turn that to like the private sector. Forgetting the war for a minute. Yeah. Do you have examples where decisions were made in the private sector where maybe they might have been considered an Intel failure from a private sector standpoint, and maybe were they tied to, say, cognitive bias, for instance? I feel like there's some parallels between the biases we see in the big picture government world affairs thing and what we've seen in private sector business decisions. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that one.
That's such a great way to weave it in. So you're absolutely right. When we think about the government, we think about the intelligence community. We have example after example of what is termed an Intel failure.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many Intel successes. It's just that it doesn't hit the news. There are things that the general public wouldn't ever know about. So I think that is another critical point to make. Looking at the private sector, to your question, I think there are a lot of different decisions that we could draw from, or lot of different examples that we could point to in the private sector of decision making that we won't call it an Intel failure, but it could possibly be cognitive bias. If we look at Blockbuster, I think that might be a good example where they passed up opportunities to buy Netflix. That could be an overconfidence bias. If we look at Kodak, how they clinged to film-based photography, even though digital photography was on the rise and they had the technology for digital imaging, that could be called a status quo bias. And these are just two examples, but there are so many. And so I think it brings the conversation full circle when we think about decision advantage, making informed, data-driven decisions. So whether it's in the government or the private sector, we have this tendency toward these cognitive biases, and it can lead to these types of massive decisions that don't always work out very well.
Yeah. Well, I think those are great examples. Blockbusters, one of those stories, I think most people probably heard at one point, Netflix really tried to sell the Blockbuster, and Blockbuster basically said, no, thanks, kid. Like, we're good. You're going to go away. We're the market, right? And they could have bought at a very small number. I don't know what it was, but compared to what it turned into. And of course, Netflix, I think everybody I know has a Netflix account, or we're all using 6 accounts for the whole world still. I'm not sure how that's working, but we all have access to Netflix at least. I don't know anybody who
Yeah.
has Blockbuster. I'm pretty sure they're all gone. I think there was one left for a while. I mean, we have a whole generation doesn't even know what Blockbuster is, right? I
That's
feel for
such a
them
good
because,
point. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I feel for them at least because they didn't know for sure. Like you said, overconfidence bias. In the moment, probably made some sense. They were doing really well still. Netflix, you could see was eating away at their, at their business, but I could see it. But the second one you mentioned is just phenomenal to me. Kodak sticking the film base when digital photography was on the rise, and they had the technology. Kodak understood what digital imaging was, and they just chose not to go down that path. Just blows my mind. I think you said that was status quo bias, and that just blew my mind because they had all of the pieces in front of them to know the benefits, cost benefit analysis between film versus digital and where the world looked to be going. And with all of that in front of them and access to the technology and obviously a dominant brand at the time, they still just stood by and watched the world pass them by. It's just egregious. I'm glad I didn't have Kodak stock apparently, because it's just brutal for them. Oh, just brutal.
It's an interesting thing. And then to your point on, we weren't in the room. We don't know how exactly the decision was made. And would we have made the same decision if faced with the same data? Who knows? It
Yeah.
is certainly fascinating to dissect after the fact.
No, that's a great point. And yeah, it's easy to be Monday morning quarterbacks. I remember, listen, I was certainly within the IC on 9/11 and after, and I remember all the things that came out after that. And you made a good point. Obviously, we can't go into detail, but we've stopped a lot of terrorist attacks as a government over the years, as an intelligence community over the years. I used to tell people, this is a constant problem every minute of every day. The bad guys only have to get one win. They win once and everybody knows all about it and it's a disaster. We win every day and nobody hears anything about it. And that's fine. I get it. Like tragedies, when these tragedies happen, everybody needs to find out how this happened. How do we prevent it? How do we do better? If you're in Intel, you understand that's the job. Our job is to prevent things. We'll miss occasionally. And when we do, we're going to pay for it. I'm totally fine with that logic. I just wish people had a better way of understanding just how many successes there are, how many interdictions there are, how many things are stopped before they become disasters. Because it's one thing to say, we need to work to do better at this. And I'm disappointed this happened and we should find a way to be better. It's another thing to malign the entire intelligence community as with every negative term that came out, whenever 9/11 happened or when other events happen. That is a little frustrating, because I know people are really, really working hard on this stuff every day. I know you do too. People who work long hours and nights and weekends. And let me tell you, if you want to get paid, the IC is not the place to do it. So they're not doing it for the money. They're genuinely patriots trying to work, what's best for the American people and overseas, for their nations as well. And it's just frustrating to see the categorization that comes out, as now you're a failure and you don't know your job. And it's because people, I think, just don't understand all the background and all the difficulties and not having the benefit of seeing the future until it's already, passed us by.
Yeah,
But with
absolutely.
That,
And so many things that are under the radar, counterintelligence. I don't think that was part of our everyday language and vernacular. Then we move into the 2016 election and things sort of change under that framework. But the amount of work that the intelligence community has done historically on that portfolio and continues to do is astonishing. And it protects our way of life. It protects our technology and our status in the world. There's so much that goes into it, and you're spot on. It's something that we all should be grateful for.
Yeah, agreed. So, all right, we've talked about the field. Hopefully people are gathering that this is a truly, this is a profession. This isn't just smart people with Google, right? And we talked about the training, we've talked about the education, we've talked about decision making, structured bias, structured analytic techniques and fighting out our biases. But now everybody's talking about, at least the big buzz is AI. AI is everywhere now. So, I mean, what do you think? I mean, how long until we're all replaced by AI? Because I keep hearing that's the next thing. We don't need these Intel analysts, right? AI is going to do it. So you're an expert. How long till AI replaces all of us?
That is absolutely not going to happen.
I agree.
In the field of intelligence analysis, you need the human touch. Now, where that comes into play, that is what can be up for debate. So there's certain things that I think we can potentially outsource to AI that will help us be more effective at our jobs, especially given the rapid evolution of technology and the incredible amount of data that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But you will always need human judgment as part of this ecosystem if we really want to do it right and if we really want to do it well.
Yeah, I agree. I've had this discussion. I think, AI, which I debate the term, this isn't sentience, right? This isn't AI like in the movies. We don't have a sentient being we're working with, but mostly it's stacked machine learning. This is, large language models, et cetera. But I think it has the potential to do great things for us. As an Intel professional,
Yeah.
I'm sure you had the same experience. The frustration was you spend 80% of your time on the research and you have about 20% of your time to actually do the
Right.
analysis and the reporting, which is where we decide what matters. I think there's a chance that technology can flip that and we can get the content to us, the right content, faster if we can go through the process of validating and vetting to make sure the machines are giving us everything, that completeness, not creating its own bias to give us just content from certain buckets. I think there's an opportunity there. And so people, humans can become superhuman perhaps. I think there's a chance to really make us smarter and better, but it isn't going to replace us, right? There's a human component machines aren't capable of, to my knowledge, aren't close to capable of yet. And, frankly, when I got to NSA in 1999, I was told literally like my first weekend, enjoy it while it lasts because you're all going to be replaced by machines. We're going to automate all this. We're not going to need you Intel analysts. And it's 20 some odd years later now, and there's more Intel analysts today than there were then. So it's not like it's the first time we've been told technology is going to get rid of us because we're expensive. But I'm with you. I think there's a human component. That content isn't there. The context isn't there. Plus, there's accountability. Who's accountable? If the machine says it and you go do it, and that's bombs on targets, or that's major business changes, and it goes terribly wrong, who are you going to blame?
Yeah.
Somebody's going to be accountable, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think
Spot on.
I'm glad to hear that you're, again, as a leader who does this, every day for one of the best Intel programs on one of the biggest companies in the world. It's good to hear your thoughts on the subject. So I'm looking forward to finding people who disagree because I'm also looking to get more different opinions. But it's been tough. I don't know also where you get junior Intel pros if the technologies replace all the junior people. Because I hear people say, "Oh, well,
Good point.
the low lying work, will be replaced by the tech." Well, I'm not working until I'm 100. So what happens when we're gone? When the senior folks have gone on to other things, where are your next senior folks coming from? If all your junior people were replaced by machines?
This is an excellent point.
Yeah.
We
All
should
right,
think
good
through that.
answers.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll follow up with
spot
that one.
on.
I'd like to get more information on that one. I think maybe we'll do another show on AI and Intel as we get more on it. And I think the technologies there's some very cool things, but I worry when people just start talking about how it's going to replace everybody, right? Especially Intel pros. So, good to hear that you're not thinking that at least. All right, cool. So we're getting near the end, but there's a bonus question I ask every guest to close out the show. Since the name of the podcast is Unspoken Security, tell me something you never told anybody before. Something so far that's been unspoken.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a tough one. As I think about communicating, so the pandemic, for instance, where everything went virtual, my communication skills, I feel, have deteriorated. And I want to walk you through a quick story when I was transitioned from the FBI to the private sector. So I went to my first meeting, I grabbed my notebook and my pen, and my boss, I got into the room, my boss says to me, "Oh, in the private sector, people bring their computers with them
Yep.
to meetings." So I was embarrassed, went back, got my computer, came into the conference room, opened it up. The boss is talking. Nobody is listening. So everyone is on their computer and they are typing. I have no idea what they're doing, but I mean, it shocked me. But I feel that it has stayed through my career in the private sector. It sort of stayed with me. And what I mean by that is that now that we're virtual, and if I am trying to speak or if somebody else is trying to speak, it's unclear to me if anybody is actually listening. And so it can throw you off when you're speaking. And so I would say I'm trying to work on my communication skills or trying to refresh them because I feel they've actually deteriorated after leaving the FBI.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't heard anybody, put it in those terms yet. I share your shock in walking into a room, some of the transitions you go from government to private sector, right? I mean, for me, it was just remembering I could bring my phone into work was a weird thing at first. But yeah, walking into a meeting, I wouldn't have thought it would be okay to open my laptop. You should be paying attention. And now I'm at a point where I walk into meetings and I'll tell people, hey, I hope you don't mind if I stare at my phone, because I'm probably taking notes on my phone. And people just have to trust that that's the case. I'm not, playing video games or something over here. I do take notes occasionally on my phone. But I think you make a good point. Communication has changed a lot, right? Through COVID, we've moved to Zoom. We've moved to a lot of distant communication structures. And as we're starting to come back together, I think norms are changing now. And yeah, you don't know if people are paying attention. I guess we just assume it. Like I've sat in rooms given presentations. They brought me in to present, and people don't look like they're paying attention to me.
Right,
I just assume they are.
It's a bit unnerving.
Yeah,
Right.
Like I just assume they must be paying attention. But I guess if they're doing emails and whatever, then I guess that's what they're doing with their time. But it's interesting.
We need to
hear
dig
you.
into this. I don't know if it's true or not. Well, I also notice that people will be pinging me during meetings. So if I'm trying to pay attention, the same people who are in the meetings are on the side pinging me on something separate, which also that maybe I'm walking into my own cognitive bias here, but that's a little bit of my evidence as it doesn't seem that anybody's listening anymore.
That's a good point too. And I'm totally guilty of that. Anybody who's ever been in a virtual meeting with me, there's a very good chance I'm on Slack messaging at the same time. I think, and the thing is, I believe I'm paying attention still. Now I'm gonna have to think about my own thinking here. I'm multitasking, right? And I'm ADD, so I'm playing through that a little bit. I can non-focus and be focused at the time. It's kind of how my thinking and learning works. But I also have to realize that that's not how everybody works. It might be disrespectful. But you make a good point. I do it all the time. I'll be in meetings and I might be in a chat, like narrating the discussion to somebody else while we're going through the meeting, or passing up other notes that hit me in the head. And maybe I'm distracting them. I hadn't really considered, maybe I got to give more thought to that.
Fascinating. We can talk further about this.
You make a good point though. I think it's great to hear the key piece you said, which is you're thinking about your own, communication, right? This isn't about saying, hey, other people have to do a better job, right? It's what has changed about me and how do I focus more? How do I communicate better? Remote's not going away. This hybrid and remote is here to stay. How do we behave differently when we're on camera like this versus when we're in person? What are the accepted norms? And maybe as much as what are the ground rules? If you come into a meeting, wouldn't it be nice if somebody told you up front, hey, everybody bring your laptops today? So you would have known coming in, because we're all coming from different cultures and backgrounds. There's no way you could have possibly known to bring your laptop on, coming over from the bureau. So that's a cool observation. Thanks. I appreciate it. I haven't thought about it. So now I've got something to think about as well, and maybe work on my own behavior a little bit. I'm sure people will hopefully listen to this, and all my friends and family and coworkers will all tell me all the things I'm doing wrong that I've got to work on, which is probably a long list. All right, cool. So listen, we're coming up on time here. I got to get to the end here and wrap this up. But any last thoughts that you want to add before we do that? Anything we didn't touch on that you want, or anything you want to clarify, or anything you want to talk about going on in the future with you? Anything at all, really, before we wrap it up?
The number one thing I want to say is thank you. This story needs to be told. And as you said during the podcast, it is on us to tell this story. So thank you. Hopefully more to come.
100%. I agree. No, thank you though. Like, listen, I agree with you. The story needs to be told, but it takes people like you. It takes professionals who've been doing this a long time, who are leaders still in this space. I appreciate you taking the time. You could have easily said no. You got a lot of things going on. Citi is very busy, I'm sure, and your team's very busy. So taking the time out today, I really, really appreciate you doing that. And absolutely, I'd love to have you back on. I know we have some other topics we talked about privately that we might be able to bring forward. So I'd love to have you back on for another episode, sometime in the not too distant future. But I really appreciate you spending time with us today and giving the audience a better understanding of what intelligence is as a career field, what intelligence analysis is, and what goes into it. And I look forward to chatting with you more in the future.
Likewise.
So for now, absolutely. Yeah. So for now, everyone, we're going to wrap up this episode of Unspoken Security. Thanks again for all of you for tuning in and listening. I look forward to your feedback. We're always looking to try to get a little bit better every day. So if there's anything else, that you're looking for, whether it's, topics you want to discuss, or you want to get some feedback on the show, feel free to reach out and let me know and let the team know. And until then, thanks for your time, and look forward to talking to you again soon. See you.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for this episode of Unspoken Security, brought to you by ZeroFox. the only unified external cybersecurity platform. If you enjoyed this episode, follow us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. See you next time.